name is, like I said, Marte Skogtrø is my full name. Lots of Norwegian letters in there. And I work as a political advisor in Frivillighet Norge, which is the association of NGOs in Norway. I've worked in the sector for over 15 years, and I have broad experience from a variety of organizations, both on the national and the local level. We started out somewhere in like a local chapter of some youth organizations. What I do in my job, like in an everyday basis, is I try to influence and advise politicians on a national level to make wise decisions for the NGO sector as a whole. And I also work with like coaching organizations in best practices. That's one of the most important things we do in Frivillighet Norge. I also work with a few European projects about civil society, so cooperation across borders and capacity building also. Projects financed with ACF money. Yes?
You said you help us make wise decisions.
Yes.
My question is, do they listen to you usually?
Yes. And that's sort of what I am getting into now. Why and how we have this very trust-based and very two-sided cooperation between like the NGO sector and the government. And in order to understand sort of why we have that and why we are where we are, it's important to see like some historical facts, and that's what I'm going to try to take us quickly through here. And that's basically what this presentation is about. I'm going to say a few things about Frivillighet Norge. I'm going to take you through a few Frivillighet Norge basics, what we do, how we work. I'm going to talk a bit about what we call the Nordic model of volunteering and how that plays out sort of in the Norwegian civil society. And I'm also going to talk a bit about the contributions of Norwegian NGOs in Norwegian civil society today. So, the Association of NGOs in Norway, or Frivillighet Norge, we are a consensus-based umbrella organization of NGOs. We have 370 plus, closing in on 380 now, member organizations representing more than 50,000 local chapters. We cover all kinds of NGOs. There's, like you say, culture, sports, leisure, youth organizations. The youth organizations also have their own umbrella. We are basically the adult version of that, but to make it even more complex, the Umbrella Association for the Youth Organizations, LNU, they are also a member in Frivillighet Norge, because we are more of a network than an umbrella.
So it's you, then the umbrella for youth NGOs, and the youth NGOs?
No, it's not hierarchical like that, because we are a network, they are an umbrella.
What about bureaucracy?
Yes, LNU is like a coalition of all the youth organizations, but within the separate youth organizations, they all have their own democratic structure within, and LNU can't like tell them what to do. We as a network work with all the stuff that's relevant for the sector as a whole. We don't go into like all the separate causes of the different organizations, but everyone wants it to be as little bureaucratic as possible to run their organization. They want to spend time with their activities, not writing proposals or reports or whatever. Everyone wants there to be a good dialogue between politicians and the organizations. Those are the kinds of things that we work on, all of the stuff that benefits the sector as a whole. And that's sort of also what LNU does for the youth organizations. They're like lifting the common voice on the cases that everyone agrees on. They're the consensus part being. And then the organizations can separately work with their core stuff. And Frivillighet Norge is politically independent and funded by the state and the sector itself. That's a luxury we have in Norway, that most NGOs are eligible for state funding, even if they're actually actively opposing state politics. So you sort of get paid by the state to work against the state, which is something we don't appreciate enough, I think, in Norwegian context. Because it's not unique, but it's not that common either. Our vision is to create a greater space for civil society. And we do this through lobby and advocacy work, of course. Like I said, I'm trying to influence the politicians to make right decisions for for the sector as a whole. And we do it also through capacity building and support. As a network, we do a lot of courses that are free for the members. So they can register for how do you recruit volunteers? How do you keep volunteers? How do you build good websites? How do you communicate in social media? How do you do all of these things that are relevant for all the organizations? We do capacity building and stuff like that. How do you influence politicians? How do you write good project proposals? How do you work in a board? All of these things are stuff that we do, often free of charge for our members, but we also do like paid courses for other organizations and networks. And of course, we also work a lot with basically increasing the visibility and knowledge about the sector in the public opinion. How do we work? We are consensus-based, which basically means we work with those things that everyone agrees on that it's a good thing to work on. If everyone doesn't agree, then it's not our thing to work with. You can apply to be a member of Frivillighet Norge, and your membership fee is set depending on how your economy is.
Can't you control any of the funds of the NGOs that you are with, your members? Or it goes directly from the state to them?
It goes directly to them. We don't finance any of our member organizations. We just work politically and with capacity building.
You just advise the politicians how to spend the government money. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
For the sector as a whole. And we don't say they should get more, they should get less. We just say, make it a better system so that when people apply, you take this into account and this into account. And this into account.
And
So the Nordic model is kind of a singular model as well. And of course, it's not completely alike in all Nordic countries, but there are a lot of similarities, which means that we can sort of talk about the Nordic model. The main things with the Nordic model is that the Nordic societies are among the most organized in the world, and has been for quite a long while. We're at the top 5 of the Eurostat. This also means that volunteering and participating in NGOs are quite widespread. But what's common is that there is a very high level of trust and a very low level of corruption. All the Nordics have this in common, even if we have different other things. This is something that has been gained through quite a long history as democratic countries, and I'm going to go a bit into this, how this has developed over time, because trust is something that takes a long time to build, and still it's very fragile and can be broken like this. And that's something we think too little about in Norway, I think, because we're so used to, over time, having this very trust-based system that we tend to forget that it's a very fragile system that we live in. We are not the EU member, for instance. All the other Nordic countries are. We are not. We are a member of the EEC, but not the EU. And also, of course, something we have in Norway where that they don't necessarily have in the other countries is the oil. It's very hard to talk about both the history of the Norwegian sector and the economy without talking about the oil. The start of Norwegian civil society goes all the way back to like 1850s. It has taken a long time to get where we are now. It's not something that was built overnight. At this point, Norwegian civil society is characterized a lot by broad ideological movements on a grassroots level. Up until 1850, Norway is largely a farmer's country. It's a long country with large distances. People live in small rural communities. Not necessarily that many big cities. We have some of them, of course. But with the 1850s, industrial revolution, right? Happens all over Europe. People move more into larger communities, into the cities. This creates new eras, and lots of NGOs are established to help with people who deal with drugs and poverty. All that type of things explode with the Industrial Revolution and people moving in from the rural areas. The NGOs are economically independent from the state. They depend on what the members or the community contributes of labor, of money, of time. We gained independence in 1814, but was still under Sweden up until 1905, the union with Sweden. So it was governed first by Denmark and then by Sweden. At this point where we see the emergence of the Norwegian state as we know it today. It's early in this period. And as we move into the 1900s and 1950s, like I said, health, social sector, as well as humanitarian work becomes the core work area of the NGOs. And it's also important in this period to talk about the first wave of women's liberation movement, because the oil and the fact that basically the whole population of Norway works regardless of gender is the two keys to the prosperity. I'm gonna just jump hurdles over the Second World War, but there was a war. Norway was occupied for 5 years, from 1940 to 1945, by the Germans. And what happened after the World War is also kind of important to how civil society in Norway has grown since. Because how the different parts of Europe developed after the World War is very important. Basically, what happened in Norway is that everyone kind of got together and agreed that we have to rebuild the country now. And for quite a long time after the World War, we had the same government, we had the same prime minister, who was let's put all other differences aside, we're rebuilding this country. Everyone sort of agreed that this is what we're doing now. It was not him, but he's become, of course, sort of the, what you call it, the figure. Yeah.
I am the generation.
Yes, you except the generation that was rebuilding the country after World War. And what happens here is that the state progressively takes over what up until this point has been the state's work areas, like schools, hospitals, healthcare centers. All of these things are progressively taken over by the state. So the NGOs has to find new areas to work in. We see then an emergence of more second level type of NGOs, not the ones taking care of the basic needs.
But more specific ones.
Yes. So you see sports, you see culture, nature, you see environment, you see leisure organizations are expansively growing in this time period. And we also see this increased cooperation. There's the establishment of various councils for not just for youth organizations, but for cooperation between the state and the NGO sector. And it's still very key to how we work with policies and everything today. Like these councils in every municipality in Norway now, there's laws that you need these kinds of councils to make. We have the second wave of women's liberation, where family planning, reproductive health and everything comes into play. Again, after the World War, there's a slight decline in women working. Again, because there was this sort of agreement that we're rebuilding the country now. Every family needs at least one person, one adult with wage work. And usually that was the men working. But this was willed politics to distribute evenly. And as things are growing and getting back to normal after the war, we see that women are going back into the workforce. And the NGOs' work with family planning and reproductive health is key for making more women be a part of the workforce. And of course also, like I said, the oil. It's almost too poetic, but it's that I had to check if this date was correct. But on the day before Christmas, in 1969, that's when they discovered the Ekofisk, which is the largest subsea, almost to date, I think, the largest subsea oil field ever found, which is enormous amounts of gold. And this was the day before Christmas in 1969. And they started working those fields in the 70s, early 70s, 1971, and in 1972, there was a law put in place that the state should own a quite large percentage of the values of the oil fields. That's still the way it is. So the Norwegian state sort of takes ownership of this large, very pollutive richness and funnels the money back into society, which basically lays the groundwork for the welfare state we have today. When you have almost unlimited amounts of money to pump into this public schools, public hospitals, all of this stuff, it's quite easy to build up a structure quite fast. And it was the political willness of again, using this newfound riches for common good rather than privatizing it and keeping it on the hands of a few people was a very important decision made.
We did the privatization one,
Yes.
and well, it's not so effective.
Just in two families.
Yes, and that's basically in most other oil-owning nations as well. It's the riches are at the hands of quite a few people. So that's what sets the Norwegian model kind of apart from that. There's this, I can show you afterwards. Because what also happened in the 90s, just to do that, is that in 1996, the government decided to put the revenue from the oil business into a large fund, which is called Oljefondet, the National Petroleum Fund, I think is the English word, which means the money grows even more.
Or the pension fund.
Huh?
And the pension fund.
Yes, it's sort of, it's securing the wealth of future generations, that's what they're calling it at least. And then there's political rules about how large a percentage of the revenue from the fund you can funnel back into. So it's not like there you can't be elected and then just spend it all crazy. There's like rules for how the politicians can spend this money. But yeah, we're closing in on today. We see that the welfare state takes care of the basic needs, which means that the NGOs continue to play pioneer roles. Working with, for instance, we have quite a substantial body of organizations in Norway working with the interests of people with rare diagnoses, for example. And also, key important, maybe extra for you in this point, is that we have a large number of organizations by and for youth emerging. Which basically means organizations run by youth, for whatever they want an organization for. Which is, again, a lot of us that work in the sector now sort of grew up in these organizations. Of course, it's to sum up the last 24 years, it's not possible. I mean, just the fact of everything that's happened since, I don't know, since the pandemic and after. But just, again, roughly, we see some of the same issues that we see in Europe as a whole. We see, again, like I talked about, the high level of trust and the low level of corruption is kind of the core at why things have worked as good as they have in Norway. But we see that this democracy under pressure, which we are all experiencing throughout the whole Europe, we see how this threatens that model because it weakens the glue. When you start to distrust the government, it's very fragile, and we are not necessarily prepared for the collapse of this trust-based model we have. We take it a bit too for granted, I think. Characteristics of NGOs. Pretty much all organizations in Norway are open to everyone and membership-based, and there's a national assembly, usually held once a year. That's the head of the organization. The National Assembly elects the board, decides the strategy, decides the budgets, follow up on the account. And the National Assembly consists of members from like all the local chapters.
How you communicate with the local policymakers? Do you have hearings or?
Yes, we have hearings.
Present people in their councils?
Yes, we have more like official hearings, like white papers and notes that are sent out and distributed, and where we are asked to give our opinion. That's like one way. We have these councils that we talked about, both on a local and national level, which are areas where we can discuss and talk about stuff. We can also directly like call or access. The distance to power is very short in Norway, which is also one of the key elements of why the whole trust thing works. Yes?
There's the politicians who would like to keep this transparency.
Yes, they depend on it because basically if they come up with some policy or some new law, that the NGOs or the public doesn't like, we're going to tell them, and they're going to have to listen to us, unless they're not going to be elected the next time, and their law is not going to pass.
Politicians listen to the people, and NGOs. That's a difference in Nordic model.
Yes, it's a difference, and basically, you will also see we call our NGOs for like schools of democracy, and all the youth parties are also considered NGOs. So basically, every minister in position now started their career in the youth chapter of their party, which is a democratic membership-based organization. So they have that, again, they've all went through that school of democracy, which also makes them understand why it's so important to have this two-way conversation with the NGO sector and civil society. Also says something about, like purely economically, why the sector is as important as it is. And it also consists of roughly the workforce of 142,000 employees each year. And I mean, in Norway, we are only 6.3, or are we that many? 5.5, it's not more. I'm bragging, putting on an extra million. 5.56 something inhabitants, and we have about 10.2 million memberships in NGOs, which basically means that every Norwegian is statistically a member in at least around two NGOs. The important role of the NGOs for people's well-being, the fact that you are helping out, doing something that's important to you, being with people you enjoy spending time with, doing activities you like, feeling like you're making a contribution to society. It's key factor for why people continue to be engaged in NGOs. But this is interesting to see how our sector is financed, because this is also quite different from many other countries. You see, the largest contributor by far are people in general, either through membership fees, through donations, through giving to campaigns. This constitutes about 44% of the financing of the sector as a whole. The state, roughly 27, the municipalities, roughly 17. What's much more important in many other countries, they only constitute a quite small percentage.
Why is that?
It's again how the sector has developed. Everything came from like that grassroots level of engagement, and it has continued to stay like that. And the fact that so many NGOs are so loosely connected to the private sector also keeps her building the trust. The NGOs are the institutions that the public trusts the most, because it's also considered to be quite independent from both the state and from the private sector. Again, even if the state sums up about 27%, the state doesn't choose to finance only organizations that work for its policies, but also a lot of organizations that work against, because that's not what your cause is not what decides if you're funded or not. It's what type of organization you are. So you will have environmental organizations who are actively working against the state's oil policy, for instance. They will still get money from the state to fund that activity. And that's also core for why the NGOs are so highly trusted and considered as independent.
It's like, we can say both positive thing, more or less. Greek society fights a lot in general, but the thing is we need to fight in the right direction and have a result. Because there are many different voices that are not organized and they don't have a focused way of approaching something to have a result.
Yes.
Everyone wants to do their way, and in the end there is no communication of what we're going, it's mixed. So there is no structure.
No.
We want to do a bit, even for youth organization, we are a bit more in youth now, but also on volunteering in an organization. and discussion with municipalities and decision making, because everyone wants to be alone and do their own thing, a bit authoritative in a way, a bit like I'm the leader. But together we are the leaders in a way, and that is the point.
Yes, and that's it's a long way to get there, but I think you're completely right. That's the direction you need to go in order to, again, like we're talking about the funneling of the civil participation, right? If everyone does their own thing completely separate, then we're never going to be that common voice that actually can be heard. And that's why it's so important with having these democratically structured organizations and having networks like us, for instance, who can voice that like common voice about the big, just the consensus. Like we all agree on this. We disagree on a lot of shit, but we all agree on this. So you better listen to this, right? Because at least here we are agreeing, all of us. Frivillighet Norge was funded because the sector as a whole decided that we want to work with the political case that NGOs should get the VAT compensation on the same level as private entities.
What is good?
The 20% you put on
The
top
tax.
on
The tax.
Yeah.
the tax.
Value added
Right,
tax
right.
is VAT.
Right.
And private companies can apply to get that VAT refunded. Right. So you don't actually pay the VAT, which means everything gets cheaper for you. NGOs didn't have that. And that's one of the main causes that people decided, okay, rather than every organization trying to influence the politicians to make up this VAT rule for the NGO sector, why don't we like employ someone to work with just that for the whole sector? That was like the first seed of how Frivillighet Norge started. And we are still working on that. But the sector also saw that there were other issues like this that would benefit everyone, right? So basically, when you become a member of Frivillighet Norge, you have to apply. You have to be in this Frivillighetsregister. You have to be a democratic organization. You have to have a transparent economy. You can't be an organization that discriminates. There are like some basic rules. Then you can apply. And you pay your membership fee, which is set depending on how large your economy is. And then you have a vote. You have one vote. Regardless of if your organization is huge or if it's small, you have one vote. But if, for instance, a new policy comes up that we feel like, okay, this is going to affect the sector a lot, then we call a membership meeting. And we say, okay, this is happening now. This is one of the important roles that we have, is picking up, like monitoring what's coming up changes, and then see this is going to be a problem for our sector. What should we mean about this? And then we call a membership meeting, and people can voice their opinion. And when we come to a consensus, that's what we mean about this. And basically, if you don't show up to those meetings to voice your opinion, then
Penalty?
huh?
Penalty?
No. It's not a penalty. But then your voice is not going to be heard. Then you sort of silence. Then you say, basically, I trust you.
Yes.
I trust the people that show up for this meeting to decide what we're going to mean about this, because I don't necessarily have a strong opinion. And we usually don't work with cases that are very controversial, because the separate organizations will work on that themselves.
Okay, thank you. This concludes your program.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I will leave you now to your cultural activity or whatever you wish to do, and probably I will see most of you next week, at least.
Thank you to Mr. Sturla for your...
Thank you, Mr.
Last day, last afternoon, last evening in Oslo, and have a good and safe travel back.
Thank you very
very
much.
much.
We also wait for you.
I will come close after. Maybe some of you still are in the airport.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not.